Hello everybody, it's Jabari here. When you hear the word empire, you probably have a standardized image of what fits the definition. You'll likely imagine a vast expansive territory carved out by a powerful army. In many cases this is true, but it's not always the case. For example, an empire can still be classified as an empire without necessarily being large. On the other hand, a nation can still be large without necessarily being classified as an empire. In the case of Africa, the word empire is used almost indiscriminately when referring to the many kingdoms that existed throughout its history. More specifically, those that existed in West Africa, much to the dismay of those who were new to the concept of an African empire, after formerly seeing empires that existed elsewhere. So the two biggest questions that people most commonly have in regards to African kingdoms are, why are they so small? And why are they classified as empires despite being so small?
So them blacks ain't never had no empire, just a bunch of tribes.
Yeah, see what I mean? So for starters, let's go ahead and cover the simplest question of this video. What is the definition of an empire? Well, there isn't really any consistent or widely accepted definition, but they do all share some similar properties. According to dictionary.com, an empire is a group of nations or peoples ruled over by an emperor, empress, or other powerful sovereign or government. Merriam-Webster labels an empire as a major political unit having a territory of great extent or a number of territories or peoples under a single sovereign authority, especially one having an emperor as a chief of state. Oxford calls an empire an extensive group of states or empires ruled over by a single monarch, an oligarchy, or a sovereign state. So with these three definitions, we can confidently say that at the very least, an empire is a militarily powerful kingdom or nation that rules over a collection of other kingdoms whom which are subordinate to one central authority. While the dictionary.com definition does not seem to place emphasis on the size of the empire, both Merriam-Webster and Oxford definitions do. Oxford clearly says an extensive group of states or countries, while Merriam-Webster leaves a bit more wiggle room, as it describes an empire as a political unit having a territory of great extent, or a number of territories or peoples under a single sovereign authority. It does not require both of these. So with these definitions, the classification of countries all around the world come into question. Let's take Canada for example. Canada is the second largest country by land area in the world. Yet it still isn't an empire, nor has it ever been labeled as an empire on its own. It was once part of the British Empire, but there was never a Canadian empire in its own right. So should Canada be considered an empire? Well, the question is complex. By all three definitions formerly mentioned, Canada fits some of them, but not enough to be considered an empire. It fits the requirements of Oxford and Merriam-Webster and the fact that it covers an extensive area, but that's pretty much where they end. One could argue the fact that Canada controls several provinces as well as territories of indigenous peoples, but not in the same sense that a traditional empire does. The modern nation of Canada did indeed form from the conquest of other peoples, but it was done by the British, not Canadians. In fact, Canada itself was under British rule until the 19th century, including those of European descent. There are also places that should be considered empires but aren't, like the United States. Like Canada, the United States was formerly part of the British Empire. However, when it acquired its independence in the Revolutionary War of 1776, there were only 13 states, which all straddled the east coast of North America. Large expanses of land were purchased from other European powers, such as the case with the Louisiana Purchase from the French in 1803, and the secession of Florida to the United States from Spain in 1819. Then of course there was the purchase of Alaska from the Russians in 1867. Despite the fact that there were indigenous people still occupying these lands, like Canada, one could argue that they weren't conquered by the United States. They were legitimately acquired from other European powers that had already done the conquering for them prior to the United States taking possession of these lands. And before I continue, let me just say that I am not trying to justify the American acquisition of these lands from the indigenous people. I'm simply stating that the initial conquerors were not Americans. So anyway, despite the relatively legitimate acquisition of these lands from European powers, the same cannot be said for the rest of the lands that Americans would colonize in years to come, with the agenda of manifest destiny, a popular, firm, and false belief that the United States expansion through the continent was both justified and inevitable. In 1848, more lands were conquered from Mexico after the American victory in the Mexican-American War. The United States also came to conquer overseas lands such as Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and Samoa through a combination of treaties and wars. By definition, the United States should indeed be considered an empire, especially during the period between the late 19th and mid-20th centuries. So what does this mean for the empires of sub-Saharan Africa? Do they fit into all of the parameters or requirements of being empires? Well, according to the dictionary.com definition, they do. African empires are composed of collections of tribes, cities, and kingdoms of all different ethnicities, cultures, and languages, all conquered and vassalized by one single authority. With that said, virtually all sub-Saharan African empires fit the criteria and technicalities required to be considered an empire. In regards to Oxford and Merriam-Webster, most African empires really only seem to be missing one key component, which is the fact that the majority of African empires do not cover an extensive area. Or do they? We often overlook the true sizes of African kingdoms and modern-day countries and even the continent as a whole. Why is that? The Mercator map is probably the most widely used map projection in the world, yet it grossly distorts all land masses at higher latitudes. With that said, there's a tendency for land masses located farther north on the map to appear much larger than they truly are. I'm sure we can all recall looking at maps when we were in school and wondering why on earth, no pun intended, is Greenland so huge, even though it's just an island. In most cases, it even appears to be the same size as Africa. But as mentioned before, the Mercator map is to blame for this. Well, now you know. Just to give you a proper perspective on the size of the African continent, Europe can fit into Africa nearly 4 times, and the contiguous states of the United States can all fit within the Sahara Desert. As for Greenland itself, yeah. So now let's take a look back at African empires. The Oyo Empire, the largest empire in the history of the Yoruba people. As a result of Africa's massive land area, as well as the misleading sizes of land masses from the Mercator map, we perceive the empire as a mere fleck of dust. In reality, it's about 20% larger than the modern-day country of Greece, and as a matter of fact, it's larger than most of Europe's modern nations. It's also roughly the same size as the American state of Illinois. Though that's not very large for what one may expect from an empire, it's still much larger than modern maps make it out to be. Not to mention, the Oyo Empire is just one example and isn't even all that large in comparison to many other African empires. The Songhai Empire, for example, was sub-Saharan Africa's largest empire in history and was nearly 11 times the size of Oyo. Just to put that into perspective, it's about the same size as Western Europe to include Spain, Portugal, France, and the United Kingdom. So with all this newfound knowledge, I'm sure we can all agree that African empires are much larger than they seem to be, and do meet most of the parameters of being empires. However, despite this newfound knowledge, there's still a lack of massive empires on the African continent as a whole, ones comparable to Rome, China, and Persia, or even the Inca Empire of the Americas, which was roughly 20% larger than Songhai, sub-Saharan Africa's largest empire. Why is this? There are 2 main reasons for this. Reason number 1 being the simple fact that Africa has such immense ethnic diversity. In fact, Nigeria alone has over 520 languages spoken and 250 different ethnic groups. By contrast, the entire continent of Europe only has around 90 languages and 87 ethnic groups. With that said, it's much easier to unify a nation of people who share the same language, culture, traditions, and ethnic identity. The more diversity, the greater the chances of cultural clashes and rebellions. This is why Africa today is plagued by more civil wars than any other continent, as many diverse peoples were forced together in new countries carved out by Europeans. Reason number 2 is that much of Africa lacked horses or written languages. Horses and writing systems allow for significant increase in communication and logistics for managing a vast empire in both an accurate and timely manner. This is why the world's largest empires were typically carved out by horse-riding people such as the Mongols of Asia. Even sub-Saharan Africa's largest empires were literate societies such as the Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia. Most were also known for having armies that were composed largely of cavalry such as the Songhai Empire. Though much smaller than the Songhai, the Oyo Empire was the largest state ever formed by the Yoruba people, and it was no coincidence that they were the only Yoruba state to ever adopt cavalry. So this begs another question. Why are the modern day countries of Africa so much larger than pre-colonial African empires? The reason is simple. Europeans simply pulled out a map and drew out large swaths of land that they wanted to conquer. This is why India is one large country today, despite formerly being composed of a collection of smaller kingdoms prior to British rule. The American continents also show a similar pattern, with the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil being some of the largest countries by land area in the world, as they were carved up by Europeans from Native Americans in a similar fashion as they did in Africa. So, in conclusion, African empires aren't nearly as small as modern map projections make them out to be. Most of them were comparable in size to modern-day nations. However, it is true that there is an utter lack of African empires that covered massive expanses of land like those found in Eurasia, and this is due to the sheer scale of ethnic diversity and the lack of written languages or cavalry in most of the continent. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and let me know your opinions. Also, if you have a video request of your own, you can submit it by supporting my channel and becoming a patron. I only accept video requests from patrons as a way of saying thanks. I'll also be occasionally posting sources and references on my Patreon publicly, whether you're a patron or not. I'll see you guys next time, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.